She didn't shout, she didn't accuse. But when Jasmine Crockett calmly asked if the president had misled the public about his own son, the entire room froze. And so did the White House. The room was hot, not from the weather, the AC was humming hard enough, but from the pressure, the kind that builds slowly, quietly, and makes even the most seasoned people fidget in their seats. It was just past 9 a.m. in Washington, D.C., and the House Oversight Committee room in the Rayburn Building was already packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras aimed like rifles. Staffers leaned against columns, eyes darting between printed statements and text updates. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the curved desk, her expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken yet. She hadn't even adjusted her microphone. She was flipping slowly through a thin red folder with pale yellow tabs peeking out, like bookmarks from a well-read novel. Across from her, Trump's longtime political advisor, Philip Greer, was being sworn in. Tall, crisp gray suit, thick frame glasses. He gave the oath with a slick smile and clasped his hands like a pastor at a press conference. He was used to these rooms, used to dancing around questions with rehearsed charm. But Crockett didn't look at him like a politician. She looked at him like a lawyer who'd already read the ending. Chairman Wilcox gavelled in the session with the usual monotone. We'll begin this morning with a round of 5-minute questioning from each committee member. Congresswoman Crockett, you'll be third. Crockett didn't respond. She was already writing something in the margin of a printout. 2 members went ahead of her. A Republican from Oklahoma who rambled about border security, then a Democrat from Oregon who lobbed a few questions about misuse of taxpayer funds. Greer answered smoothly, almost smug. His voice was calm, his jokes dry, his tone practiced. Then it was Crockett's turn. She didn't lean in dramatically. She didn't smile. She reached forward, clicked on her microphone, and started without even greeting the witness. Mr. Greer, she said, voice low but clear, you've served as special counsel to the president since late 2020, correct? Yes, ma'am, he said, nodding once. Proud to do so. And part of your role involves reviewing public disclosures and White House ethics compliance. Among other things, yes. His voice had that familiar PR polish. Crockett raised her eyes to meet his. Including any and all personal legal settlements involving the president or his family? The room shifted. It was subtle. A collective inhale you could almost feel. Greer hesitated. I'm not sure I follow. Crockett didn't blink. Let me help you follow. According to court records from Maricopa County, Arizona in 2001, a sealed paternity dispute involving an unnamed respondent and a woman whose name I won't say to protect privacy was quietly resolved. You're aware of that? Greer blinked. I don't have any knowledge of that case. No, she asked. That's surprising given that the timeline overlaps with the first few months of Mrs. Melania Trump's pregnancy. A pregnancy, I might add, that's been carefully shielded from media scrutiny to an almost unnatural degree. A murmur passed through the room. Chairman Wilcox interrupted, voice sharp. Congresswoman Crockett, we are not here to discuss private family matters. She kept her tone calm. I understand that, Mr. Chairman, but I'm simply asking about the integrity of White House disclosures. If a sitting president knowingly misrepresented the paternity of a child, and if that misrepresentation affected how the public engaged with him, especially during his presidency, that's no longer private. That's politics. Wilcox narrowed his eyes. You'll keep your questions relevant and respectful. I always do, she replied softly before turning back to Greer. One more time, did you review any sealed court records as part of your ethics compliance role? Greer looked shaken now, not dramatically, just a flicker of panic behind the eyes. He swallowed hard. Not that I recall. She slid the red folder closed and tapped it gently. That's strange because your name appears on a clearance form for those exact files dated March 8, 2022. A long pause. Someone coughed. Another staffer scribbled notes without looking up. Crockett leaned back. I yield my time. But the room hadn't processed what just happened yet, and the next few minutes would change everything. Philip Greer hadn't said a word in 3 minutes. Not to the chairman, not to his lawyer, not to anyone. His mouth was slightly open, like he was waiting for someone to tell him what just happened. But no one did. Jasmine Crockett had calmly picked up her pen again and was underlining something in a second folder. This one blue. On camera, it looked like she was doodling, but in person you could see the calculation in every movement. She didn't glance up once as 2 more committee members spoke. One tried to redirect the conversation to environmental security briefings. The other cracked a weak joke about golf trips. Neither topic landed. The hearing had shifted. Everyone felt it, even those pretending not to. Across the room, a junior staffer for Congressman Nolan Royce, a Republican from Alabama, typed frantically on his phone, likely updating a group chat with a panicked summary. Crockett just went nuclear, but Crockett hadn't shouted. She hadn't raised her eyebrows or smiled smugly. That was the unsettling part. She looked like she just asked about postage rates. When the gavel signaled her second round of questioning, she didn't wait. Her mic clicked on mid-motion. Mr. Greer, thank you for your earlier answers. She didn't bother to ask if he was ready. I'd like to clarify something. You say you've never reviewed sealed paternity court documents, yet your signature appears on a clearance form submitted to the Department of Legal Affairs in March of last year. You were listed as the liaison for special review, along with an attorney from the president's personal team. Greer leaned toward his mic. Congresswoman, I'm not sure what document you're referencing. She held up a printed copy. You've never seen this? He hesitated again. Not that I recall. That's your signature, though? She asked. He stared at it, blinked. I'd need to review that in detail before I could confirm. That's fair, she said. Then, but you'd agree that if the president requested clearance to view sealed court records involving a paternity matter, and your office approved that request, the public would have a right to know. I'm not confirming that such a request happened. I'm asking hypothetically. Greer paused. If the situation involved national security or impacted public trust, then yes, but that's a wide assumption. Crockett leaned forward for the first time, just slightly. The only thing wide, Mr. Greer, is the gap between what this administration says and what it does. A soft gasp from the gallery. One reporter adjusted their camera angle. The tension was no longer subtle. It was in every breath, every twitch, every creaking chair. Jasmine flipped to another tab. You're aware of the president's 2005 deposition in the marital assets case, the one involving the Trump Organization's asset reevaluation? Yes. You remember he was asked about any existing non-disclosure agreements involving children? That deposition is partially redacted. She didn't flinch. But the redacted portion mentions an unnamed dependent born within the marriage timeline. I can't speak to that. No, but I can. Gasp this time, not whispered, audible. Crockett reached into the folder and held up a blurry enlarged scan. This was filed the day after that redacted section was discussed. It's a request to extend confidentiality protections to minor children, including any who may not have been previously named. She placed the document down gently. Again, I'm not making claims, I'm asking questions. Because if the public has spent nearly 2 decades admiring a family narrative built on misrepresentation, That affects how they vote, how they trust, and whether they should keep trusting. Chairman Wilcox spoke up. "Congresswoman," she didn't even turn toward him. "I'm almost done." She stared directly at Greer. "Did the president ever direct your office to limit what the First Lady could say publicly about her son?" Greer shifted in his seat. "I can't answer that." Crockett gave a slow nod. "Of course not, because that answer would be the beginning of something else." She turned off her mic. Silence stretched. Wilcox didn't gavel. No one moved. No one whispered. What Crockett had done wasn't just a dramatic accusation. It was precise, surgical. She hadn't claimed that Barron Trump wasn't the president's biological son. She didn't need to. She simply placed enough pieces on the table for the American public to start connecting them. And in that moment, the myth of Trump's perfect, untouched family image, that proud photo op version of him holding a Bible and kissing a golden-haired child, started to tremble, but the real chaos wasn't in that room. It was in the White House, where everything was just beginning to unravel behind closed doors. Inside the White House, the atmosphere shifted in under 2 minutes. In a side room adjacent to the Roosevelt Room, President Donald Trump was seated in front of 3 flat-screen monitors. One was tuned to C-SPAN, another to Fox News, and the last to a closed-circuit feed of the hearing. He had a Diet Coke in hand, a half-eaten Egg McMuffin on the table beside him. At first, he barely glanced at the screen. He'd sat through hundreds of hearings. He'd learned to ignore most of them, but something about Jasmine Crockett's tone caught him off guard. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't smiling. She sounded like someone who'd already checked every fact twice and didn't need a second run. "Who the hell is that?" Trump muttered, leaning forward. His aide, a mid-30s strategist named Ray Kolb, stiffened. "Congresswoman Crockett, Texas. Freshman last cycle, lawyer." Trump waved the explanation off. "I know who she is now. Why is she talking about—" He stopped. He heard it. The question. If the president ever directed your office to limit what the First Lady could say publicly about her son, that was it. The sentence. The match. Trump stood up so fast, his chair slammed backward into the wall. "Cut the feed," he barked. No one moved. "I said cut the goddamn feed." One of the aides lunged for the remote, killing the C-SPAN monitor, but the other 2 screens still showed Crockett's face frozen mid-sentence. He pointed to the screen. "You call that respectful? That's slander. She's implying my wife had an affair on national television." Ray spoke carefully. "She didn't say that directly, sir." "Don't split hairs with me, Ray. She said it without saying it. That's worse." He turned to his press secretary, who had just entered the room. "I want a statement in 15 minutes. Call it character assassination, defamation. Pick a word and make it sound like war." She nodded and left in a hurry. Trump turned back to the other staff. "And you, get Greer on the phone. Now." Greer was still in the hearing room. His phone buzzed under the table. He didn't answer. Back at the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly, flipping again through her notes. On social media, clips of her questioning were already spreading. Someone had captioned one moment. "This isn't about scandal, it's about trust." Within minutes, #CrockettTruth was trending on Twitter. One post showed a side-by-side comparison of the 2005 redacted deposition and the follow-up filing she had referenced. Another showed a pause still of Trump's reaction from the White House feed, taken just seconds before he stood up. His mouth was open, his brow furrowed. The image said everything without needing a caption. The networks reacted fast. CNN ran a red banner. Crockett questions White House honesty on president's family history. Fox News fired back with, "Freshman Democrat makes baseless personal attack on President Trump." The White House press secretary returned, less than half an hour later with a printed statement. Today, during a highly politicized ethics hearing, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett made baseless and disgusting insinuations regarding the president's family. We categorically reject her lies and will be exploring all legal avenues in response. But it was too late. The clip had already hit over 6 million views. In Dallas, a retired judge tweeted, "Crockett didn't accuse, she asked." And that's the difference between gossip and accountability. In Phoenix, a local journalist reposted a 2001 birth record registry showing multiple sealed entries from a private medical facility in Scottsdale, right around the date Crockett had referenced. People weren't believing the rumor. They were believing the silence that followed it. And in the Oval Office, Trump paced. "She set a trap," he muttered, and everyone walked into it. Ray stood by the window, unsure what to say. "She didn't say he's not my son. She just asked questions. She framed it like a lawyer, like a smart-ass lawyer on a mission. Now, if we overreact, it makes it worse." Trump spun toward him. "So what, we don't respond?" Ray shook his head. "We respond, just not the way you usually do." Trump narrowed his eyes. "I don't like that tone." Ray didn't speak again, and for the next few minutes the White House stayed quiet. Outside, the storm was just beginning, but Crockett wasn't done, and neither was the American public, who were now watching her with sharper eyes than ever before. By noon, the West Wing was no longer operating on its usual rhythm. Security staff noticed the shift first. Fewer pleasantries, more people moving briskly without eye contact. White House counsel's office was packed, and phones were ringing nonstop. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but everyone felt the same thing. Something had cracked. The president's inner circle had split into two camps. One group, led by Communications Director Vince Lattimore, wanted to go nuclear. "We treat this like an attack on the presidency itself," he said, pacing hard enough to loosen a floor tile. "We slam her for personal misconduct, smear her credibility. We flood the news cycle with distraction, crush the story with noise." The second group, smaller but sharper, sat quietly. Mostly legal aides and one outside strategist named Celia Dorn. She was the only one with a law degree who hadn't worked for Trump during his first term. "She didn't accuse him of anything," Celia said flatly, arms crossed. "She asked a question that implies something and backed it with 2 documents we can't disprove. If we attack too hard, we confirm the panic." Vince turned on her. "You think we just sit on our hands?" "I think you remember what year it is," she said. "This isn't 2016. Twitter doesn't forgive and forget in 24 hours anymore." She asked about public records. If we call her a liar, someone's going to dig deeper. Silence. That was the real threat, not the question, not even the rumors. The threat was people looking for answers in places they'd ignored before. Meanwhile, Trump stormed in from the West Wing hallway, red-faced and speaking before the door even closed. "She called me a fraud on live TV. I want her sanctioned, expelled, thrown out. Do something." Vince jumped to his feet. "We've got drafts for a statement calling for censure." "I don't want a statement," Trump snapped. "I want her crushed. Put something on her. Anything. You're telling me she's got no skeletons?" Celia didn't flinch. "That's a dangerous game to play, sir. If you're asking whether she has baggage, the answer is yes. Everyone in this building does. But if you go after her family or her past after what just happened, you'll look desperate." "She made it personal," he shouted. "She dragged my son into it." "Not directly," Celia replied. "And that's what's working." For a second, Trump said nothing. He looked tired, angry, but tired in a way that hadn't shown before. It was like someone had touched a nerve he didn't know was still raw. And maybe deep down, it wasn't even about the facts. Maybe it was the realization that he couldn't control this story the way he used to. Outside the White House gates, the press was waiting. The clip of Crockett was now on every major network. NBC had brought in a body language analyst. MSNBC ran a segment titled "The Power of Asking the Right Question." Even conservative circles were struggling with how to frame it. Some claimed Crockett had crossed a line. Others warned that denying what she said too strongly might feed into a larger scandal. On the Hill, several senior Republicans were being advised not to comment unless directly asked. In Dallas, an AM radio show spent 20 minutes dissecting the moment. "She didn't say the boy ain't his," the host said. "She said the country has a right to know if he's not. That's not an accusation, that's a mirror." Back inside the West Wing, Trump sat behind his desk, fists clenched. "Get her voting record," he said suddenly. "Get everything. I want every bill she's voted against. Find a quote I can use, something with fire." Ray Kolb entered the room again. "You should know something, sir." "What now?" "She's not responding to media requests, not even her staff. She's just letting the clip speak." Trump's jaw twitched. "So she plays silent, I see." Ray cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, she might not need to say anything else." Outside, a reporter shouted a question at the press secretary during the daily briefing. "Does the president deny that sealed records exist regarding the 2001 paternity dispute?" She froze for a second, just long enough for the cameras to catch it, and that pause did more damage than a lie. But the real firestorm wasn't coming from D.C. It was brewing in living rooms across America, where people were starting to ask, what if she's not wrong? Capitol Hill felt like it had taken a punch it didn't see coming. By early afternoon, phones in the offices of nearly every House committee member were ringing non-stop. Donors, reporters, voters, colleagues. Some were furious, some were worried, and some were intrigued, but none of them were quiet. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, wasn't answering her office phone, not because she was hiding, but because she'd told her staff to hold all non-urgent calls. She wasn't dodging the storm, she was studying it. She sat on a couch in her office, shoes off, hair tied up, laptop open on her lap. A news anchor's voice echoed from the muted TV above her. "She didn't accuse the president of anything," the anchor was saying. "She asked a question. That's where it gets slippery." Her chief of staff, Bryn Morales, stood by the window holding a list of press requests. "CNN wants you on tonight," she said. "Also Joy Reid, Trevor Noah, and a podcast out of Baltimore with 1 million followers." Crockett didn't look up. "I'm not saying anything today." "You sure?" "Yes." "You know they're already writing op-eds calling you reckless, right?" Jasmine finally looked up. "Good. That means they heard me." Bryn exhaled, then tossed the request list onto a side table. "You think they're going to try to censure you?" Crockett shrugged. "Let them. If they do, that's 3 more headlines. I didn't accuse anyone. I asked about documents. That's my job." Over in the Speaker's office, things were less composed. House Speaker Grant Ellings, a Republican from Missouri with a history of backing Trump on most fronts, was pacing his office visibly rattled. He'd spent the past 2 hours fielding calls from party donors, right-wing influencers, and the White House itself. "She's baiting us," he said, voice tight. "She wants us to react." His deputy, Congressman Rourke, nodded. "But we have to respond. We can't let this become the story of the week." Ellings pointed to a news ticker running across the bottom of the TV screen. Jasmine Crockett questions White House transparency over Barron Trump's parentage. He turned it off with a remote and muttered, "God damn it." The GOP whip had already circulated a proposed joint statement condemning Crockett's comments as dangerous innuendo and personal attacks masked as oversight. Some wanted her formally reprimanded. A few quietly wondered if maybe it was better to leave the issue alone. Senator Audrey Callan from Montana said it best in a closed-door lunch that afternoon. "If you start swinging at her, you'd better be clean, and no one in this room is clean." Meanwhile, online, Crockett was being cast in every possible light. A bold truth-teller, a shameless provocateur, a legal genius, an attention seeker. But regardless of opinion, the one thing everyone agreed on was this: she had changed the tone of the conversation. Even members of her own party were caught off guard. Congressman Joel Valencia, a moderate Democrat from Nevada, reached out privately through back channels to ask, "Was that planned?" She responded through a staffer, "Every question I ask is." At a community center in Jacksonville, Florida, a woman named Shonda Jacobs watched the clip for the third time on her cracked iPad. She was 57, worked in accounting, and had never liked politics much. But something about how Crockett spoke stuck with her. "She wasn't cruel," Shonda said to her friend. "She was calm, just asked what nobody else would." In Kansas City, a retired Navy vet called into a local radio show and said, "She's playing chess. That ain't a scandal, it's a strategy." The host laughed, but they agreed. Later that evening, the official GOP response hit social media. It was a long, carefully worded post condemning Crockett's highly inappropriate speculation. It accused her of weaponizing motherhood and exploiting private family matters for political gain. It called on the House Ethics Committee to investigate potential breaches of decorum. But it was too late to shape the narrative. The story wasn't just about Barron Trump anymore. It was about why no one had asked the question until now, and what else people had been too afraid to say. In her office, Jasmine finally put her laptop down. She glanced at the clock. 4:37 p.m. Bryn sat across from her, watching her carefully. "You sure you want to stay quiet?" she asked again. Jasmine nodded. "Yes?" Bryn raised an eyebrow. "You're not even going to tweet?" Crockett smiled just slightly. The truth doesn't need punctuation. But while she stayed silent, the machine around her, media, government, and public opinion, was just starting to spin faster. The walls of Congresswoman Crockett's office were thin, not literally. They were lined with drywall and wood paneling just like every other office in the Cannon building. But politically, they were paper-thin now. Every hallway conversation, every intern's whisper, every closed-door meeting across the hall somehow made its way back to her team. And everyone had an opinion. Her office, though, was quiet. Not stiff, not anxious, just focused. Jasmine sat at her desk without her blazer, sleeves rolled, hair pulled into a loose bun. Her desk was a mess. Not from panic, but from movement. Pages spread out, 3 highlighters uncapped, one AirPod in, and a half-drunk coffee sweating into a coaster. Bryn Morales was pacing again. This was her default setting when things got noisy outside. She held a legal pad filled with talking points, but hadn't used a single one all day. "They want you to retract," she said flatly. Jasmine didn't look up. "Who's they?" "House leadership, not officially. But they're hinting. The minority whip called twice. Said it might cool things off if you reframe your language." "I never made a claim." "I know that. You know that. But the headlines ran anyway." Jasmine leaned back in her chair. "Then that's on the headlines, not me." Another aide, Darian, stepped in from the hallway holding a printout. "Congressman Royce just called you an embarrassment to the chamber on Newsmax. Also, the Daily Ledger is floating a rumor that you have a secret donor linked to pharmaceutical lobbyists." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "That's creative." "It's all garbage," Bryn said, now standing still. "But you know how this goes. If they can't hit you on facts, they'll try everything else." Jasmine stood and walked to the window. Her view was nothing special. a patch of trees and a row of parked cars, but she stared anyway. "They're scared," she said softly. "Not of me, of the silence that followed what I said." That pause? That was people realizing we've never really asked who these public figures are behind their image. Darian nodded. "You didn't accuse, you just turned on the light." Bryn exhaled. "But now they're trying to break the bulb." That afternoon, Jasmine's inbox was a war zone. Death threats, love letters, interview requests, demands for resignations. But one email caught her attention. Subject line, "Thank you." It was from a woman in Idaho. No blue check mark, no political affiliations, no tags, just a few quiet paragraphs from someone who'd spent years believing she was wrong to ask questions about people in power. Jasmine read it twice. Another message came in from an old law school professor. "You spoke like an attorney who wasn't afraid of silence." Good. That's where the truth hides. Later, her office received notice of a possible ethics complaint being drafted by House Republicans. It wasn't official, just a heads-up passed through a senior staffer. "They think you violated decorum," Bryn said, scanning the memo. "Claim is that you used your time to spread unfounded rumors and personal attacks." Did I name the child? No. Did I accuse the president of lying? Nope. Did I fabricate a document? Not even close. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. "Then let them file it." Bryn hesitated. "You're sure?" Jasmine walked back to her desk, picking up the red folder again. "I'm not going to be the reason this country stops asking questions. If they want to drag me through the mud, they better know how to swim." Outside the office, reporters were still camped near the elevator. Inside, Jasmine's team met behind closed doors and ran simulations. What if she's censured? What if Trump sues? What if the media turns? And for every question, Jasmine gave the same response. Let them try. She wasn't being arrogant, she was being ready. Later that night, someone sent her a video clip, not from a news network, but from a local community college in Dayton, Ohio. A political science professor had paused his lecture and showed his class the hearing clip. He told his students, "This is how language works in real power, not yelling, not tweeting, just control." The class was silent afterward. A few took notes. One asked if she was going to get in trouble. The professor shrugged. "Sometimes you have to choose between making friends and making change." But outside her office, the press wasn't the only thing waiting. The rest of the country had questions too, and they were starting to look for their own answers. By the time night fell over D.C., the media floodgates had blown wide open. Every primetime show, left, right, and center, had something to say, not just about Jasmine Crockett's question, but the way she had asked it. Calm, surgical, no accusation, just the kind of silence between sentences that made people fill in the blanks themselves. Over at MSNBC, the headline read, "Crockett uses the law like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer." On Fox News, the Chirony screamed, "Democrat Congresswoman hurls disgusting allegation at president." CNN went with a more careful approach, unpacking the ethics of family privacy in American politics. Jasmine didn't go on TV, she didn't tweet, she didn't give a single statement. And that, ironically, made her even more visible. On The Night Circle, a late-night roundtable show hosted by Cale Brunner, the debate got fiery. "She said nothing, but she said everything," Brunner told his panel. "She didn't accuse, she asked. And that's what's got the White House on fire. They don't know how to clap back at a question." One guest, a conservative commentator, rolled her eyes. "You don't bring up a child unless you're trying to smear. Period." She knew what she was doing. But another guest cut in. "This is a government hearing. If sealed court records involving the president exist, especially ones he wants accessed through his own legal counsel, then asking about them isn't slander. It's oversight. Meanwhile, deep in the archives of public interest journalism, reporters started digging, not into Crockett, but into the breadcrumbs she left behind. A journalist named Theo Martins out of Tempe, Arizona, made a quiet post on his Substack. He didn't shout, he didn't speculate. He just posted 3 links, one to the 2001 court docket in Maricopa County marked sealed, one to a Department of Legal Affairs clearance form signed by Philip Greer, and one to a little notice 2005 request to redact names from a Trump Organization deposition. His final line, "Sometimes the paper trail says more than the press release." That post got shared over 10,000 times in 3 hours. On Reddit, a thread titled, "Crockett just opened a closet we forgot existed," surged to the front page. Users were analyzing her speech frame by frame, matching pauses with document mentions, digging into Melania Trump's old interviews, where she avoided answering questions about Barron's early years. Someone posted an old clip from a 2006 Slovenian interview, where Melania had given a vague smile when asked if Trump was in the delivery room. Another pulled up a now-deleted tweet from a former Trump staffer who once posted, "Sometimes the loudest silence in this White House has a blonde haircut and speaks 3 languages." It wasn't proof, it wasn't fact, but the internet didn't need proof to keep watching. Back in D.C., late-night hosts had a field day. On Glass Table, comedian Laura Chang played a parody version of the hearing, pretending to ask her own lawyer, "Did the president father that child? I can't recall." "Okay, but did he father any child within the United States?" The crowd roared, but not everyone was laughing. Inside the West Wing, President Trump had given strict orders to blacklist Crockett from every future White House event. Her name was now on a list circulated internally with the words "Watch closely" typed in red. His team held a meeting about pushing favorable press the next morning, hoping to bury the story under economic updates. But every headline pitch was rejected. "We're not leading with gas prices," one staffer said flatly. "This isn't 2010. People care more about secrets than savings." In her apartment across town, Jasmine sat on her couch with a glass of water and the blinds drawn. She watched the clips quietly, not for ego, not for feedback, but to study how each network twisted, sliced, or ignored what she had actually said. She took notes, one column for exaggerations, one for distortions, one for truths. Her phone buzzed. "Bryn again. You're everywhere." Jasmine sighed. "And yet I'm nowhere." Bryn paused. "They want you on State of the Union this weekend." "No." Trevor Noah's team asked again. Still no. "So we're really saying nothing?" Jasmine nodded slowly. "The truth sounds louder when you don't chase it." Outside, a group of tourists walked past her building. One of them pointed to a phone playing a clip of the hearing. "She didn't flinch," the guy said. "Did you see that? She just asked the question and left it hanging." And that's what lingered. Not what she said, but what she didn't. But silence can only last so long, because now the search for answers was starting to reach places even Crockett hadn't expected. For the first time in nearly a decade, a sealed paternity case from 2001 was back under the microscope, not through leaks, but through public curiosity that had finally grown teeth. Local journalists, legal researchers, and freelance investigators, people who'd spent years drowned out by national news cycles, suddenly found themselves with an audience. Not because they had something to prove, but because Jasmine Crockett had made people realize no one had really looked. Theo Martins, the Arizona journalist who posted the court docket, was now fielding calls from NPR, Vice, and even the BBC. But he kept his head down. He wasn't chasing the rumor. He was tracking paper. At 7:14 a.m. on a cloudy Thursday, he posted another update. Case CV 2001-4907 was sealed unusually fast, within 48 hours of initial filing. The presiding judge had no history of handling family court cases prior to that week. Filing party listed as Jay Teller, with an attorney tied to real estate transactions in Trump Tower. That post alone was enough to push another round of questions forward. In D.C., a pair of law students from Howard University found a second document, a 2005 privacy petition from the Office of Legal Affairs. The petition requested that a minor child of high-profile public interest be granted indefinite confidentiality across all jurisdictions, citing emotional distress and political targeting. The child wasn't named, but the timing matched perfectly with Crockett's references. Meanwhile, newsrooms that had once ignored fringe cases started assigning reporters, not necessarily because they believed the claim, but because silence now felt like complicity. One journalist, Tanya Marino from the Indianapolis Star, filed a FOIA request for internal communications between the Trump administration and the Maricopa County court system between 2017 and 2019. She didn't get the documents. They were still under review, but the request itself became part of the story. And while no single piece confirmed anything, every new breadcrumb made the question more difficult to dismiss. Inside the White House, legal staff met behind closed doors. "This isn't defamation," one attorney said. She didn't accuse him of anything false. She asked a question tied to public records. Legally, we're stuck. Trump's personal lawyer, a sharp but increasingly tired man named Peter Sandler, rubbed his eyes. "What if we try to unseal the original case ourselves? Get ahead of it?" "That's a risk," another staffer chimed in. "If the documents say nothing, it kills the story. If they say something, we just confirmed it." Trump was silent for a moment, then, "Find out who else has access. Seal whatever you can. I want this dead." Back at the Capitol, the Ethics Committee had received over 30 formal complaints, most from constituents, not lawmakers. Some demanded that Crockett be censured. Others demanded she be protected. The committee chair, a Democrat from Minnesota named Lorraine Pete, knew a trap when she saw one. "If we censure her, we amplify her," she told colleagues. "If we don't, we look afraid." So the Ethics Committee did something rare. They tabled the issue. Across the country, Americans weren't waiting for an official verdict. In Pittsburgh, a high school civics teacher used Crockett's hearing clip as part of a unit on First Amendment rights. She paused the video after Crockett's question and asked her class, "What makes this legal?" A 16-year-old student answered. She didn't say he lied. She asked if he told the truth. That's protected speech. In Tucson, an older woman called into a local radio show and said, "I voted for Trump twice, but I got 3 grandkids. If somebody tried to pass one off as someone else's and used it to win sympathy votes, that's not family. That's strategy." Online, another wave of independent analysis exploded. Former campaign staffers anonymously confirmed that Trump's media team was always weirdly sensitive about barren questions. One staffer wrote, "We were told never to mention the timeline of his birth, ever." It wasn't proof. But again, it wasn't about proof anymore. It was about a question that kept refusing to go away. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett stayed silent. No interviews, no new tweets, no press briefings. She showed up to committee meetings like always, took notes, cast votes, and left. Her silence was louder than the chaos. Reporters waiting outside her office eventually gave up. Constituents flooded her phone lines with support. And inside her office, Bryn quietly watched the momentum grow. "You think it's going to reach them?" she asked one night. Jasmine didn't look up from her notes. It already has. But the story wasn't just about sealed records or paternity anymore. It was about what people started seeing when someone finally gave them permission to look. More, they were reading between the lines. And they weren't asking if the rumor was true. They were asking why no one had asked sooner. In Boise, Idaho, a retired nurse named Ellen drove her granddaughter to school with the radio on. A local host said, "Maybe it's nothing, but even if it is, why did he react like that?" Ellen turned to her granddaughter and said, "If a question shakes someone that much, maybe there's something they're trying to hide." In Santa Fe, a former Marine and lifelong Republican posted a thread online. "I don't like her politics, but that was a hell of a move. If you're confident in your truth, questions don't rattle you." In Miami, a pastor included a line in his Sunday sermon. "Sometimes the power of a question can reveal more than the certainty of an answer." That line ended up quoted in a Washington Post op-ed 2 days later. Even on Capitol Hill, the mood had shifted. Conversations in elevators, cafeterias, and corridors were laced with coded references to the question. Some Democrats kept their distance, quietly waiting to see if Crockett had gone too far. Others watched her walk into hearings like she hadn't just caused the loudest political pause in recent memory. Republicans, meanwhile, were split. Congressman Royce, the one who had called her an embarrassment earlier in the week, doubled down on cable news. She crossed a line. You don't use a child to score political points. But behind closed doors, his aides were panicking. Polling data from several swing districts showed a spike in approval for Crockett, not necessarily because of the paternity rumor, but because she had the nerve to ask a question that most people assumed no one was allowed to ask. In Pennsylvania, a woman named Myra Deeds, 62, retired post office supervisor, told her book club, "Even if the kid's his, that's not the point. The point is, we've been treating these people like royalty for years." All she did was remind them they work for us. Across social media, something stranger was happening. People who had never liked Crockett or never heard of her began to repost the video, not with praise or outrage, but with quiet acknowledgement. One caption read, "I wouldn't have had the guts, but she did." Another, "She held the mirror up. The reflection is our problem now." And slowly, the discussion moved beyond Trump. People began asking broader questions. What do we actually know about the people we vote for? Why are some topics treated like they're off limits? Why does any question about the president's personal life feel like crossing a minefield? At a town hall in Billings, Montana, a man stood up and asked his congressman, "When was the last time you answered a question you didn't want to hear?" The room got quiet. In Dallas, a group of high school seniors asked their government teacher if elected officials could legally avoid answering questions during hearings. The teacher said legally yes, but politically that depends on the public. The public was watching now, not just Crockett, not just Trump, but everyone. Even members of Congress who had nothing to do with the hearing were suddenly more careful about their responses in committee. Press briefings grew more cautious. Statements were vetted twice. In a way, Crockett had broken something. But it wasn't decorum. It was the illusion of safety that powerful people wrap themselves in. Back in her office, Jasmine finally sat through one of the Sunday morning panel shows. She watched two analysts argue about her intentions, one claiming she had gone too far, the other calling her a surgeon of rhetoric. She turned it off before they finished. Bryn came in moments later. "There's a rally in Baton Rouge next week. They want you to speak. You'd be headlining. Civil rights groups, media, they're calling it a transparency march." Jasmine didn't respond right away. "You want to do it?" Bryn asked. "I didn't ask the question to start a movement," Jasmine said. "But you did." Jasmine looked out the window again. Quiet, the street below was calm. A man walked a dog. A teenager on a skateboard flew past a stop sign. And somewhere across the country, a family sat down to dinner with the TV off and asked each other what they really believed about the people they voted for. But while the noise outside grew louder, Jasmine knew one thing. Real change doesn't happen when you speak. It happens when people start asking their own questions. The headlines didn't last. They never do. By the following week, the country's attention had already shifted to another crisis. A stock market scare, a foreign policy flare-up, an NFL player scandal. But somewhere in the quiet, Jasmine Crockett's question still hung in the air like unfinished business. She never said Barron Trump wasn't the president's son. She never claimed fraud, never shouted, never threw a punch. She just asked. And sometimes that's the loudest thing a person can do. In her apartment on the edge of Capitol Hill, Jasmine sat on the floor, cross-legged, eating leftover Thai food straight from the container. Bryn was there too, sitting sideways on the couch with her laptop glowing in her lap. "Did you ever think it'd go this far?" Bryn asked. Jasmine chewed slowly, then shook her head. "I figured I'd get a couple of angry op-eds, maybe a slap on the wrist. I didn't expect teachers using it in classrooms." "You made a dent," Bryn said. "I wasn't trying to," Jasmine replied. "I was trying to hold the line." They sat in silence for a few minutes. The TV was on in the background, muted. Another committee hearing, this time about agriculture subsidies. No chaos, no headlines. And then Jasmine spoke again, softly. "You know what stuck with me the most?" she asked. "What?" "That pause. After I asked Greer the question, it wasn't fear, it wasn't shock. It was like everyone realized they'd been trained not to ask." Bryn nodded slowly. "That's how power works. It doesn't just silence people. It convinces them certain questions aren't even worth asking." Jasmine stared at the wall, eyes unfocused. "I just wanted to make one of those questions okay again." Later that week, she returned to Texas for a town hall. It wasn't flashy, a high school auditorium with folding chairs, spotty air conditioning, and a podium someone borrowed from the science department. Still, over 300 people showed up. Most of them didn't care about sealed documents or old depositions. They came because they felt something shift. They came because someone in Washington had finally spoken without a filter, without fear, without trying to be liked. When it was time for Q&A, a man in his 70s stood up near the back. He wore a worn denim jacket, hands buried deep in his pockets. He cleared his throat and said, "I'm not here to talk about the boy. That's their business. But when you said that people deserve to know the truth about their leaders, I felt that. I served 2 tours, paid off my house, raised my kids. I've always played by the rules. And for the last 15 years, I've felt like the rules keep changing for everyone else. You brought that back." Jasmine nodded. "Thank you." He sat back down. Another woman stood up, younger, maybe late 20s. She wore a hoodie with South Dallas Reads printed across the front. "I'm a teacher," she said. "And this year my students asked me why history books leave stuff out. I didn't have a good answer. But when I showed them your clip, I told them, this is how you ask the questions no one else wants to hear." There was a long pause in the room after that. A good pause. After the event, Jasmine stood at the edge of the stage, shaking hands. One woman leaned in and whispered, "You don't have to say it. Just keep asking what they won't." That night, alone in her car before heading back to her hotel, Jasmine finally opened her Twitter app. Notifications were still rolling in. Thousands. Praise, attacks, threats, compliments, theories, all of it noise. She didn't tweet. She just opened her notes app and typed, "Truth doesn't always arrive like a verdict. Sometimes it shows up as a question no one's willing to answer. Then she turned off her phone. Back in D.C., the Ethics Committee never filed a formal reprimand. The sealed records remained sealed. The president never addressed the claim directly again. And Crockett, she went back to work. Hearings, amendments, policy debates. But something had changed. Not just for her, for the people who watched. The question had been asked. And now, even if they forgot her name, they'd remember what it felt like to hear it spoken out loud. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to remind them that silence should never be the default. If you believe in asking hard questions, if you believe leadership means accountability, not just authority, subscribe to the channel. Stay engaged. Because the moment we stop asking, the answers disappear.